¿cómo andan? Buenos días a todas y a todos. Es un gusto tenerlos por aquí y ver que hay tanto interés en estas actividades de este año del programa de Real World Evidence que estamos haciendo desde el Departamento de Evaluación de Tecnologías y Economía de la Salud de IEX. Yo soy Federico Gustavo, que veo a muchos conocidos en el webinar. Un placer verlos y les mando un gran saludo y darles la bienvenida desde el IEX, y le paso la palabra a Sebastián García Martí, que es el coordinador del programa que estamos llevando a cabo este año.
Gracias, Fede. Romy, creo que vos tenés que darme video porque no puedo prender yo mi cámara. ¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo están? Bueno, como con muchos ya nos conocemos, ¿sí? Mi nombre es Sebastián García Martí, soy el coordinador del Departamento de Evaluación de Tecnologías Sanitarias y Evaluaciones Económicas en el IEX. Bueno, como este es el segundo webinar, ¿sí?, de Real World Evidence. El primero fue cuando inició el curso introductorio, y este es el segundo webinar que la semana que viene inicia el curso avanzado, ¿no? Durante este año, básicamente, estamos llevando a cabo esta iniciativa de capacitación regional sobre la utilización de Real World Evidence, tanto para aspectos regulatorios como para aspectos de cobertura. La iniciativa comprende dos cursos, ¿sí? Un curso introductorio que ya finalizó, un curso avanzado que comienza la semana que viene, un ciclo de webinars en el cual este es el segundo y va a haber un tercero a fin de año, y algunos selección de proyectos de los cuales se va a hacer mentoría. Por lo cual, nuevamente, como dijo Federico, es un placer, sí, que estemos todos acá en este segundo webinar, donde tenemos presentadores de lujo realmente, ¿sí? Tenemos a Kenneth Quinto, que es un Senior Medical Advisor for Real World Evidence Analytics, ¿sí?, de la FDA, ¿sí? Por otro lado, también vamos a contar con una presentación de Laurie Lambert, ¿sí?, que es PhD en Epidemiology and Biostatistics, y now is the lead for Real World Evidence en CADTH, ¿sí?, la Agencia Canadiense de Evaluación de Tecnologías Sanitarias. Y por otro lado, va a hablar Gustavo Mendes Lima Santos, ¿sí?, de ANVISA, la agencia regulatoria de Brasil, pero no sabemos si quizás tuvo algún problema o algo. Hasta ahora no nos estamos pudiendo comunicar con él, o sea, quizás...
Ya está presente, Sebas.
Ah, perfecto. Perfecto, bueno, no sabía si ya había podido ingresar Gustavo. Entonces, bueno, la tercera presentación va a ser de Gustavo Mendes con respecto a ANVISA. Las preguntas las vamos a dejar todas para el final, ¿sí? Ustedes pueden hacer las preguntas tanto en la ventanita de preguntas y respuestas, ¿sí? O si alguno quiere hablar o quiere que se vea su cara, puede solicitarlo y también puede hacer la pregunta en forma oral, ¿sí? Por lo que, bueno, comenzaremos con la primera presentación de Kenneth. Muchísimas gracias, Kenneth, nuevamente.
Thank you so much, Sebastian, for inviting the US FDA to speak at this webinar. I'm very happy to be here. Let me share my screen. Can everyone see my screen? So I'm Ken Quinto. I am a Senior Medical Advisor for the Real World Evidence Analytics team at the US Food and Drug Administration, at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and the Office of Medical Policy. And like I said, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation to speak on behalf of the FDA. I will be going over FDA's Real World Evidence program. So I don't have any conflicts of interest to disclose at this point. So the US FDA was mandated to look at real world evidence due to the passage of the 21st Century Cures Act in 2016 by the US Congress. And in the 21st Century Cures Act, it mandated that the FDA establish a program to evaluate the potential of real-world evidence use to support new indications for drugs approved under Section 505C and to satisfy post-approval study requirements. There was a mandate that the FDA draft framework that was issued, that to be issued in December 2018, and that draft guidances for the industry would be issued by December 2021. Just a reminder that within the 21st Century Cures Act, the standard for substantial evidence remains unchanged, and the commitments are aligned with the Prescription Drug User Fee Act passed at that time. The FDA's RWE framework was released in 2018, and this applies specifically for the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research and the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, but not to the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health, as that medical devices are under different legislation and mandates. This is a program to implement RWE by creating internal processes, having external stakeholder engagement, with demonstration projects and guidance development. Real-world evidence definitions from the 2018 framework define real-world data as data relating to patient health status and or delivery of health care routinely collected from a variety of resources, including electronic health records, administrative claims data or medical claims data, product and disease registries, patient-generated data, including in home settings and other sources that can inform health, such as wearable devices. Real-world evidence is a clinical evidence regarding the usage and potential risk benefits of medical product derived from analysis of RWE, and it can be generated from different study designs, including randomized trials, externally controlled trials, or observational studies. This is a graphic published by my supervisor, John Concato, and my office, our center director, Jacqueline Corrigan-Cry, in the New England Journal of Medicine recently, looking at the reliance of RWD in different types of study design, with the left-handed side being not as reliant on RWD, such as randomized control trials that use RWD in planning and support of trial sites and criteria and trial feasibility, moving all the way to the right with increased are the most reliance on RWD, including non-randomized, non-interventional studies, such as observational studies, with non-randomized interventional studies, such as externally controlled trials with external control arms somewhere in between. So looking at the FDA approach for RWD for effectiveness, the key considerations from the 2018 framework included whether RWD are fit for use, whether the trial or study design used to generate RWE can provide adequate scientific evidence to help answer the regulatory question, and whether the study conduct meets FDA regulatory requirements. As I had mentioned previously, the evidentiary benchmarks remains unchanged, where the FDA substantial evidence standard that generally requires 2 adequate and well-controlled clinical investigations, where the goal is to distinguish effect of a drug from the other influences such as spontaneous changes in disease course, placebo effect, or bias. Common practices to reduce bias include probabilistic control of confounding through randomization. In 2021, CDER and CBER released several guidances, including a guidance for registries, electronic health records, and administrative claims, data standards, as well as regulatory considerations. For the electronic health record and claims data, this draft guidance was released in September 2021. Comments for the September 2021 guidance have been submitted and closed, and FDA is currently going through those comments and will release the final draft guidance later this year. The focus on the draft guidance for electronic health records and claims data include the selection of data sources to appropriately address the study questions, development and validation of definitions for exposures, covariates, and outcomes, data provenance during accrual curation analysis of data. The choice of study design and method of statistical analysis are considered outside this guidance scope. Data standards draft guidance was released in October 2021. The focus of this particular draft guidance is the processes for managing RWD, conforming RWD to FDA data standards, mapping RWD to FDA submission standards, and considerations for data transformations. And this guidance applies regardless of the type of RWD submitted. The third draft guidance was for registry data, and this was released in November 2021. The focus of this guidance was using the registry data to support regulatory decisions, the relevance and reliability of registry data, considerations when linking registry data to another data system or another registry or another data system, and considerations for regulatory review. Considerations for real-world data and real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making for drug and biologics. Guidance was released in December 2021. And this particular guidance focused on the transparency regarding data collection and analyses, RWD data access, study monitoring, safety reporting, and other sponsor responsibilities. There are a couple draft guidances to release in 2022, including considerations for the design and conduct of externally controlled trials for drug and biologic products, and using clinical practice data for randomized controlled trials for regulatory decision-making for drug and biologic products. This is subject to change, but those are the planned draft guidances to be released in 2022. I'd just like to go over Prograph's new indication based on RWE that the FDA approved last year. So Prograph or tacrolimus was approved for prophylaxis for organ rejection in patients receiving liver transplants back in 1994, which is later approved for kidney and heart based on RCT evidence. RCT evidence for randomized controlled trial evidence for lung transplant was not submitted to the FDA. The drug is widely used in clinical care for lung transplant, and the sponsor submitted a SNDA for this particular indication for lung transplants. The study and data design were evaluated according to FDA standards, and approval for preventing rejection, death, and lung transplant was granted in July 16, 2021 of last year. The data was from the U.S. Scientific Registry of Transplant Recipients data on all lung transplant conducted in the U.S. from 1999 to 2017. The design was a non-interventional observational treatment arm compared to historical controls. On review, the FDA determined that this non-interventional study with historical controls to be adequate and well-controlled. Of note, outcomes of organ rejection and death are virtually certain without therapy, and this dramatic effect treatment helps preclude the bias as an explanation for the results. There are numerous demonstration projects funded by the FDA that are looking into other aspects of RWD and RWE in this particular space. One of the first projects I'd like to talk about is the OneSource project. This is a conceptual approach that to improve the quality of real-world data, and that entering the right clinical data once and being able to use the data many times, including for research. The focus on this particular project is the standard integration of standard-based tools within the electronic health record systems to bring together healthcare and research. There's a collaboration between the US FDA and the University of California, San Francisco, and there's an ongoing demonstration project in the breast cancer clinical trials. One of our most popular projects is the RCT duplicate. And the RCT duplicate project demonstration project is to assess whether observational analyses can align with our previously published RCTs. This is the use of longitudinal insurance claims data used in observational cohort analyses to emulate randomized clinical trials on the same topic. And these randomized controlled trials had their results previously published prior to engaging this particular analyses. There are a couple of new metrics that were developed for this particular project. One is regulatory agreement, and that is to what extent would the RWE replication led to the same conclusion as the RCTs regarding statistical significance. Second one is estimate agreement. Does the RWE treatment effect estimate lie within the confidence interval of the true effect based on evidence from the RCT? And there was a public meeting to discuss these results in February 2021 and more recently in May of 2022. These are the agreement metrics that I spoke about earlier. Regulatory agreement on the upper left-hand trial or the top row show that the RCT confidence interval and point estimate lie on the same side as the RCT. The next line down shows regulatory agreement and but no estimate agreement, where the point estimate does not lie from the RWD analysis, does not lie on the same confidence interval as the RCT, but the same regulatory agreement would have been made. The third row shows no regulatory agreement, but estimate agreement, where there is crossing of the either point estimate of 1 for the superiority trials or the non-inferiority margin and the non-inferiority trials, but the point estimate for the RCT trial or RWD trial lies within the confidence interval for the RCT trial. And the last row at the bottom, where there is no agreement, no regulatory agreement, and no estimate agreement. The initial results of the RCT duplicate were published in Circulation of 2020, where the conclusions that agreement between the RCT and RWE findings vary depending on which agreement metric you use. And the interim findings indicate that selection of the active comparative therapies with similar indication than use pattern enhances the validity of RWE. Even in the context of active comparators, concordance between the RCT and RWE findings is not guaranteed, partially because the trials are not emulated exactly. And more trial emulations are needed to understand how often and in what context RWE matches RCTs. Another demonstration project that is funded by the FDA are the neonatal demonstration projects. And this is undertaking with a Critical Path Institute, where a data platform to incorporate neonatal data, electronic health record data, is used to develop generalized reference ranges for neonatal laboratory values and develop a disease progression model for bronchopulmonary dysplasia, chronic lung disease, which recently affects premature infants. And more than 5,900 de-identified patient-level data points will be incorporated into this data platform. The last thing I'd like to briefly talk about, given I think I might be running low on time, is the FDA My Studies platform, which is developed by my previous supervisor, Dr. David Martin, that uses a mobile app to collect survey information from participants in clinical studies. This is through the use of a mobile app, which is on your Apple iPhones or Android phones, a web configuration portal, which is led by the researchers, which can send out surveys to the participants' phones so they can use the app to fill out these surveys and send these surveys to a secure storage environment. There are 2 demonstration projects currently ongoing with the FDA My Studies, one with the Spark registry, which is collecting information for individuals with 18 years of age with confirmed inflammatory bowel diagnosis from academic community sites. And the data collection from these patients started in April 2020. The other demonstration project that we have at this time, it was the LIMIT JIA trial, or juvenile idiopathic arthritis trial. And this is whether to collect information, whether the 6 months course of cutaneous abatacept plus the usual care versus an external control arm for patients with usual care alone. And the outcome being looked at is the extension of the disease to more than 4 joints, new uveitis, and or the treatment with systemic medication at 12 months. The unique thing about this is we are collecting the primary outcome uveitis from ophthalmology appointments within the trial, having the patients or the patient's parents fill out the information about whether there is uveitis or not in the survey itself and not from the ophthalmologist. There is also collection of adherence information and adverse events of the study drug with a drug diary. So in summary, the FDA established a program to evaluate the potential use of real-world evidence to support new indication for drugs approved under Section 505C and to satisfy post-approval requirements. There was draft framework issued in December 2018, and draft guidance is recently released through September through December 2021. And 2 more guidances planned for this year, and the substantial evidence remains unchanged. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues for the help in developing the slides, and thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Kenneth. Thanks, Kenneth. Thank you very much for your presentation. Digo, aunque ya fue escrito en el chat, ¿sí?, que pueden ir, a medida que van sucediendo las presentaciones, si se les ocurren preguntas, ¿sí?, las pueden ir escribiendo en la ventanita de preguntas, aunque las vamos a responder al final. Pero quizás en el momento de estar escuchando la presentación les surge una pregunta, la pueden ir dejando anotada ahí y después las contestamos al final. Laurie, when you want to start your presentation, and thanks again.
Yes, so thank you for this opportunity to present what we're doing at CADTH. Next slide, please. So you can see I have an alignment with what Kenneth just presented about, because, you know, we need to think about, well, what do we mean by real world data and real world evidence? So we're at the moment just using a working definition of saying real world data is just information collected outside of the paradigm of a randomized trial, and that real world evidence is information that's derived from the analysis of this data. And we consider that real world evidence is considered as complementary to randomized trials and not a replacement. And it might include data, you know, medical administrative databases, registries, observations from clinical practice, and as well as patient-reported information. So you do see there's a lot of different definitions. So this is what we're using for our work. Next slide. So we launched, just to say, we're in an early period. We launched a learning period, and we are focusing on rare disease in October of 2021. And if you go to the CADTH website, you'll see there's a lot of links to what we're doing, but there's a lot happening. So I suggest that you just go directly to the website. And I might just take an opportunity here to point out, I'm not sure if everyone in the audience of, you know, we just had a presentation from FDA, which is making regulatory decisions. And what CADTH's role is, we are in a public health system in Canada. CADTH makes recommendations about whether a drug should be reimbursed or not within the public system, and what value does it add to the treatment that already exists within the health system. So the decision-making context is different, and that has an impact on the activities that and how we use RWE. Next slide. So our goals are, one, so Health Canada is the regulatory authority in Canada. So we are providing what we're learning about RWE to Health Canada in partnership with them, and specifically to support a rare disease strategy for Canada that Health Canada is working on at this moment, and also to develop methods and standards for CADTH, to appraise and review drugs for rare disease or complex therapies. Next slide. So we had a best brains exchange. A report's going to be released very soon on the CADTH website. And that was really when I just started at CADTH. And so we managed to get about 150 people from across Canada together and just discussed all the different perspectives. We had a number of stakeholder groups, including we had patients, we had industry, we had the regulators, we had RWE experts, we had public payers, private payers, HTA. So really a broad range of perspectives, and had an event over 2 days just to talk about RWE. And that was really a kickoff for us of our activities. And really from analyzing all that discussion, we decided that there were 4 key strategies or pillars that we needed to be able to start using RWE to support decision-making. So one was multi-stakeholder engagement and dialogue, and there's a lot of literature about that, but that you need to get all the different perspectives and what their information needs are in order to plan what sort of data or information is needed to support decision making. So that's one strategy. We also, a bit like we just saw from Kenneth, we need guidance on how, what RWE is going to be accepted by CADTH, how should it be submitted, how is that information going to be appraised by CADTH, how will it be used in deliberation. So all that side of things needs to be worked on. And then we know it really came out from the best brains exchange. We need data. We need to know, do we have it? So we've really learned in Canada that we actually have, good quality data. We have a lot of data, but people are unaware of what data exists, and so we need a strategy to identify, first of all, we want to do an inventory of what information exists out there about rare disease, but what quality is it, and how can we improve that quality working with them. And we need to establish standards, as was just mentioned by Kenneth. What makes a good registry? And we know registries are particularly important for rare disease. And then we need to work better together to have collaborative partnerships. So we're really working hard to develop relationships, and that's something hopefully that we're doing here today. So with our regulatory partners, but also with the data holders, with the decision makers, with patient organizations, with clinicians, and also international partners. And we've created a steering committee to try and encourage that. So those are the strategies that we're really focused on. Next slide. So in terms of multi-stakeholder dialogue, our vision is that we would have a dialogue, with all the stakeholders around the table very early on, because an early dialogue can even help inform how can you do a better trial that better represents the real world setting. And for us in Canada, so often a randomized trial may not reflect the reality in Canada. And so that makes it more difficult to make decisions. After a clinical trial, depending on the results and depending on who is included in the trial, we would have to have a discussion. What other data is needed to fill the gaps that were not covered by a trial? After the HTA recommendations, there might be or need to be a discussion about maybe there was uncertainties noticed, or for example, often pediatric patients were not included in the trial, or elderly people or women. So what data do we still need to collect even after HTA? And then also post-market, if we're seeing things happening, in the real world setting that is providing new evidence to know how to optimally use a therapy, or a device, then data could be collected there and brought back to have further decision making. Next slide. So our progress report, if you want to see it, for multi-stakeholder dialogue, we've had a panel. We looked at dementia when there was upcoming new drugs for Alzheimer's that could have had a huge impact on the system. So we've written a report about that. We're now about to publish another report where we also talk to care providers. We've had meetings with patients and caregivers for pediatric glioma. And we've also now had our first multi-stakeholder meeting concerning, a real disease rather than just theoretically for pediatric glioma. And we're in the process of writing that report and publishing that. And so these sorts of learning projects are going to inform a guidance document of how Canada should use multi-stakeholder engagement and dialogue. Next slide. In terms of guidance, we had from the province of Quebec, there had been a lit review on RWE guidance. It's been updated. We have established an expert panel with people from around the world, including FDA and within Canada, using a Delphi process to come up with principles. And that preliminary guidance document will be available at the end of October is the plan to present that for the first time this year. Next slide. There we go. For our partnership strategy, we are in a pilot now with the Canadian Institute for Health Information. So that's all hospital data for all of Canada is centralized and collected in one place. And what we're developing, how do we work together so we can access that data quickly to support decision making? We're also working with Statistics Canada for the same thing. How do we create better access? We learn about what each other do so that we can get information more quickly. Also with ICES, which is the Institute of Clinical Evaluation Sciences, and HDRN Canada, again, happily, providing data from across Canada. Next slide. And then we're also developing partnerships internationally. So we're participating in a number of working groups or panels with our international partners so that we can learn what they're doing, how can we help each other. So really just starting to try and work together, which I think, is something extremely important for real world evidence. Next slide. This is our Pan-Canadian RWE Steering Committee. So I know these organizations, but you saw CIHI. So we have data holders, we have payers. IMC Biotech represents industry on a national level. CORD represents a patient organization, Pan-Canadian Patient Organization for Rare Disease. CIHR is Canada's Institute of Health Research. PCPA they represent the public payers and work together for negotiation of prices and so on. So really trying to bring, the key Pan-Canadian organizations all together in one place. We're meeting 4 times a year. We're providing our progress reports on our learning projects so that we can all learn together and really just develop, these trusting relationships, which are so important to make change, and also to develop this trust in RWE by working together. Next slide. For our generation and access, there's a request tool, which is a tool to appraise registries. So we're identifying registries and we're asking them to try and complete this tool, share with us their experience of it, and CADTH needs to learn how will they, in a systematic and standardized way, if registry data is submitted to support decision making, how can we appraise the quality of that data and its fitness for purpose, as we say. So we're learning about that using that tool. We're trying to create an inventory of all the rare disease registries in Canada so that we know what is available to support decision-making. And then we want to use the tool to appraise the quality of that. And then we're also identifying case studies. So our first case study is about to be published so that we can give some examples of success stories really to hopefully inspire and learn from about using registry data to support decision-making. Next slide. Also within CADTH, we have expanded our scientific advice program. So we already had a scientific advice program that was really early for planning RCTs. So now we've expanded the scientific advice so they provide advice on real-world evidence and advising about protocols, after a pivotal trial has been finalized. And we're getting a lot of interest in that program from around the world, really. We're also working with our library services within CADTH because they were mostly before always looking for RCT data. So we're learning, how do we identify registries? How do we identify real world evidence to support decision-making to fill gaps? So we're learning about that. And we did conduct an environmental scan. This is specifically for rare disease, looking at how it's done around the world to inform CADTH about how they will support decision-making for rare disease. Next slide. And we have also, on September 1st, CADTH will now have a post-market drug evaluation program. So where the public payers in Canada can send in a request to do an evaluation about a drug's safety and effectiveness. That's post-market, so it's obviously going to be in the real world setting. So that whole program is going to launch September 1st. And, as you can see, to respond with credible and timely evidence for decision makers. And so that obviously is going to be based on a lot on real world evidence. And that's why we need to know where data is. We need to know how to assess the quality of data. How do we present it? How does it fill gaps? How do we report that to decision makers? So you can see how everything is very interconnected between the four strategies. Next slide. So in conclusion, just to say, we are in a learning period, and the way, from an HTA perspective, we see that real world evidence can fill gaps in clinical evidence to have a more comprehensive assessment of the safety or effectiveness of drugs or health technologies, in a broader population, perhaps over a longer period of time. And that is taking into account the context of the Canadian healthcare system. And we know there can be big differences, between health systems that's going to affect the impact of a particular drug or device. Next slide. I think that's just to say thank you, and happy to talk to people later, receive emails, and I think you can see from the presentation, we're really interested in learning and collaborating to try and move forward in this space. So thank you for your time.
Laurie, thank you very much. I realized that there were many links in your presentation. Maybe, Laurie, if you agree, we can make like a document with all the links just to put in the campus and to be available for everybody. Perdón, paso a español. El video de este webinar va a estar disponible, ¿sí?, en el campus y también en el sitio web del IEX, pero más allá de eso, como muchas de las presentaciones, por ejemplo, la que realizó recién Laurie, que tenía muchos hipervínculos a distintos documentos e iniciativas dentro de CADTH, quizás vamos a extraer los hipervínculos de la presentación para armar un documento con todas las fuentes y todos los proyectos que Laurie recién mencionó. Nuevamente, muchísimas gracias, Laurie. Bueno, vuelvo a repetir, sí, que realizamos las preguntas al final, si las quieren ir escribiendo en la ventanita de preguntas y respuestas. Y pasamos a la tercera presentación. Gustavo, muchísimas gracias, ¿sí? Un placer que estés acá, cuando quieras.
Hola a todos, yo voy a hablar en portuñol. Yo pienso que es una posibilidad de estarmos más juntos, que hablamos de una cuestión que es muy importante para nosotros acá en Latinoamérica, con el desarrollo de los temas de datos de vida real y de mundo real para la aprobación regulatoria de los productos farmacéuticos.
Perdón, Gustavo, te hago una pregunta. ¿Vos preferís que yo pase tus diapositivas o las preferís pasar vos? Yo lo puedo hacer por vos.
Yo voy a compartir mi pantalla ahora.
Perfecto, muchas gracias.
Sí, mira, por favor, si está todo cierto.
Sí, se ve bien.
Se ve bien. Bueno, mis diapositivas estarán en inglés para mis colegas de FDA y de Europa para que vean. Pero me gustaría de hablar que la perspectiva que tengo acá para compartir con ustedes es de la perspectiva de avaliación regulatoria y la perspectiva de agencia reguladora de ANVISA, que tiene una estrategia de evaluación baseada en riesgo-beneficio de los productos. Eso es una presentación que no representa que ANVISA está haciendo, que ANVISA de la institución, pero mis personales visiones del tema. Y yo empiezo diciendo que en Brasil los conceptos utilizados de los datos de vida real, de las evidencias de vida real, son muy próximos dos que están siendo utilizados en las discusiones científicas sobre el tema. Vemos acá que los datos de vida real son datos que pueden venir de diferentes fuentes, que no son los estudios clínicos de eficacia, de eficacia o de seguridad de los medicamentos, los estudios controlados, randomizados, pero sí de fuentes como los registros de pacientes o de otras fuentes electrónicas, datos de utilización de productos por sistemas de gobierno. Entonces, son datos que no son comúnmente utilizados por agências para la decisión. Y son datos que son muy próximos en muchos aspectos con la farmacovigilância, porque son datos de observación, datos de notificación de utilización del producto que muchas veces se confunde en esos casos. Acá en Brasil, nosotros tenemos dos posibles fuentes de datos de vida real en el país. Tenemos un dato de gobierno, que es el DataSUS, que es una fuente pública que se registran todos los procedimientos médicos, todos los medicamentos que son utilizados por los ciudadanos, que van al sistema público de salud brasileño. Pero también hay datos privados como estudios que son conducidos por empresas o estudios académicos, estudios observacionales, registros de pacientes cuando se tiene una empresa o una institución que evalúa o que registra los datos de los pacientes para la evaluación o para compensación, o mismo la farmacovigilância. Ya hay datos de vida real que componen los dossiers de registro de medicamentos en ANVISA. Y tenemos esos datos tanto generando evidencias de seguridad, por ejemplo, en estudios observacionales de medicamentos que fueron utilizados en otros países, o estudios farmacoepidemiológicos que fueron utilizados por otros países, pero también hay evidencias que pueden ser utilizadas para demostrar la eficacia del producto. En caso de doenças raras o muchos medicamentos que son oncológicos, nosotros tenemos acá datos que pueden ser utilizados, estudios que pueden utilizar como comparadores, dados históricos, respuestas históricas de bancos de pacientes para se comparar com a eficácia de um novo tratamento. E também temos mais recentemente estudos de efetividade de vacunas de COVID-19. Um exemplo que é mais recente de utilização de fontes de dados de vida real acá foi a aprovação de Coronavac para crianças, para niños a partir de 6 anos. Esses dados que foram coletados do governo de Chile, que foram dados que se utilizaram, que se passearam na vacunação de mais de 15 milhões de niños, de indivíduos, com a vacuna Coronavac ou a vacuna de Pfizer. Essas duas vacunas foram cadastradas e os dados foram coletados por el governo, verificando tanto questões de segurança quanto questões de casos confirmados de COVID depois da vacunação. Isso foi um estudo, então, de coorte que incluiu niños de 6 a 16 anos que estavam afiliados ao sistema chileno de registro. E todos tiveram seus critérios de elegibilidade para receber as vacunas evaluados por el governo. Este estudo de efetividade comparou os resultados entre diferentes populações pediátricas que utilizaram Coronavac ou Pfizer em 2021 e a efetividade foi evaluada por meio de uma avaliação de risco, risk ratio entre os tratados e os não tratados, os que se vacunaram e os que não se vacunaram, e os índices de risco foram estimados considerando a avaliação, a extensão de Cox, no modelo de risco de Cox. E acá temos os resultados de efetividade da vacuna. Então, quando se compara, por exemplo, de la Sinovac, se comparou que se evaluou na efetividade de 74,12% na avaliação estratificada, e também para isso para os casos de COVID positivos confirmados. Para os casos de hospitalização, temos acá, então, uma efetividade de 90%. Esses dados que estou mostrando para vocês foram utilizados para se ampliar a população que seria possível utilizar a vacuna, baseada nos dados de efetividade e também de segurança dessa população. Então, esse é um exemplo muito importante acá de cambio de la indicação de uma vacuna baseada em dados de vida real, porque não são estudos controlados, randomizados, são estudos de registro de pacientes, registro de população de serviço público chileno. Bueno, usar os dados de vida real para generar evidências de vida real e ter uma decisão regulatória traz muitas perguntas. Uma pergunta é se o dado está adequado para uso regulatório. E quando eu digo adequado, significa que se há traçabilidade, se há confidência que os dados são dados adequados para isso. Também, se tem dados de vida real, el diseño de estudio tiene que ser adecuado también para una evidencia científica que puedan ayudar o responder las preguntas regulatorias. Y también los dados tienen que cumplir con requisitos regulatorios como buenas prácticas clínicas, cómo los datos fueron coletados, houve monitoreo de los dados. Entonces, son preguntas regulatorias que tienen que ser respondidas para que al final verificamos si hay una adecuabilidad, una adecuabilidad de los dados para la decisión. Adecuabilidad, como yo dije, si hay calidad de los dados, hay una padronización, hay una coleta adecuada de los desfechos, trazabilidad, consistencia de los dados. Nosotros vemos que aún hay muchas dificultades para esos tipos de coleta y de datos. Acá en Brasil, un ejemplo, los registros de pacientes acá tienen muchas limitaciones. Por ejemplo, los termos que son utilizados para definir la doença o la reacción adversa o los datos de seguridad, muchas veces no están estandarizados, no están padronizados. Los accesos a los datos brutos también, a los registros de dados también muchas veces no es posible. Diferentes formatos de se reportar la información y también las dificultades de integrar los datos de diferentes fuentes para un paciente único. Esas son limitaciones y desafíos que tenemos. Para estudios observacionales y farmacovigilâncias para una decisión regulatoria sin la base del estudio clínico randomizado, tenemos que nos atentar también a algunas limitaciones. Por ejemplo, la falta de transparencia antes del inicio del estudio. Tiene que tener transparencia sobre cuáles las intenciones, cuál el protocolo, cuáles son la manera que se va a hacer los estudios, porque si estamos hablando de una evaluación que es retrospectiva, los dados ya están lá. Los dados pueden ser manipulados para se atingir un objetivo específico. Entonces, tiene que ter mucho cuidado con el protocolo y mucha certeza que no hubo manipulación de los dados para llegar a una conclusión. Porque se puede evaluar diversas veces hasta se tiene el resultado esperado. Entonces, tienen que ser procedimientos muy claros para evitar esos problemas. Para Brasil, más específicamente, tenemos una consideración que gostaria de compartir con ustedes para que vean cómo se es posible se avanzar en el tema. En primer lugar, no hay aquí en Brasil una normativa, una regla que se tenga claro cuáles son los termos, cuáles son las posibilidades de usos. Aún en Brasil es algo que se está discutiendo, pero es algo que aún se necesita más, una padronización más para se llegar a una conclusión. Estamos en Brasil, ese trabajo tiene que ser colectivo entre reguladores, industrias, centros, academia, universidad, para se llegar en decisiones sobre normativas, sobre cuándo se puede utilizar y cómo. Nosotros ya tenemos casos de submisión que tienen esos dados, como yo he dicho, como los casos de doenças raras, los casos también de medicamentos oncológicos, pero tenemos que sí saber cómo esos datos irán soportar una decisión regulatoria y que deben ser cuidadosamente evaluados. También esses dados de vida real acá en Brasil são muito interessantes, especificamente, e são uma grande oportunidade para produtos, por exemplo, que só tem fase 2. Acá em Brasil é possível que alguns produtos, por exemplo, de doenças raras, só tiene datos de fase 2 que são muito promissores, pero el fase 3 é muito difícil de se fazer. Então, é possível então pensar em compromissos pós-aprovação para estudos e generação de dados de vida real para decisão. Também acá em Brasil temos isso que chamamos de grandfather drugs, pero são fármacos, são medicamentos que são muito antigos acá em Brasil. São moléculas que há muito não se fazem estudos clínicos, não hicieron estudos clínicos controlados, randomizados, com associações que são muito específicas acá em Brasil. E por isso, dados de vida real e evidências de vida real podem ser importantes para decisões regulatórias para esses produtos. Bueno, isso era o que me gostaria de compartilhar com vocês. Estou à disposição para perguntas e para discussões que pensam que seja importante. Muitas graças.
Gustavo, muchísimas gracias por la presentación. Bueno, pasamos a la parte de preguntas y respuestas. Como habíamos dicho antes, son las 13, ¿sí? Por lo cual vamos a tomar 10-15 minutos más, ¿sí? Previo a comenzar con la parte de preguntas y respuestas, quería aclarar el financiamiento de esta iniciativa, ¿sí? Que toda la iniciativa, tanto los cursos como la serie de webinars y demás, es un grant irrestricto académico por parte de Pfizer, ¿sí? Que Pfizer otorgó al Instituto de Efectividad Clínica y Sanitaria, y todo el contenido de la iniciativa, la forma, los objetivos y demás, son responsabilidad del IEX, es un grant completamente independiente. Quería aclarar el financiamiento de la iniciativa en general antes de pasar a las preguntas y respuestas.
Bueno, buenísimo, ¿qué tal? Vamos a leer para ir en orden, si les parece bien. Primero las preguntas que nos llegaron a la sección de Question and Answer. Yo las voy a leer en español, Doraría las va a interpretar para los panelistas. Después veo que hay algunas manos levantadas también, así que después podemos pasar a un minutito de charla. Andrés Mejía, si los ensayos clínicos son caros, realizados por la industria farmacéutica, los real world evidence buscan ahorrar gastos, se generan más gastos pero resulta en información complementaria, y cuál es la diferencia entre un real world evidence y un estudio de farmacovigilancia o de fase 4.
Por ahí, Kenneth es un buen candidato para atajar esta
Yeah,
pregunta.
I'm happy to answer. So randomized control trials are very expensive for the sponsors, those conducted in the US and elsewhere in the world. One of the the examples, or one of the promises of real world evidence in at least at FDA and sponsors who submit to FDA at these real world evidence studies can be conducted more quickly as well as more cost effectively in comparison to clinical trials. As I noted in my presentation, the ProGraph approval for lung transplant was not potentially feasible with a randomized control trial, given the high mortality of patients who do not receive immunosuppressive drugs like ProGraph. That is another place where real-world evidence can come into play, is ethical dilemmas where traditional randomized control trials cannot be conducted ethically. In terms of pharmacovigilance versus phase 4 trials, that is the difference between the safety and effectiveness for phase 4 trials, is looking at the basically safety and post-market requirements. Depending on the sponsor's application, there may be post-market requirements put on by FDA that the sponsor look at particular safety concerns that were not able to be evaluated as fully as would have been liked in the phase 4 studies. So that can be potentially conducted through real-world evidence studies. For the phase 4 trials, I would note that those that the indications for FDA is that those trials the indications for real-world evidence based on real-world evidence are drugs that had previously been approved by Section 505C that had randomized controlled trials, and these four are additional indications. Going back to my ProGraph approval, that had been previously approved for liver, kidney transplantations, that the new indication was for specifically lung transplants. I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in.
I just wanted to add the point that I've certainly learned from all my consultations of just starting in this space is this fear of lowering the bar. So no one wants real world evidence to lower standards, to assess safety and effectiveness. So I think it's really important. There has to be really good reasons why you cannot do a randomized trial. It can't just be we're going to do it instead of. So I think that's just a really key point for people to think about.
Gracias, muchas gracias a ambos. Pasamos a la siguiente pregunta. Gabriel pregunta, ¿cuál es el enfoque? Creo que quisiste poner FDA en medical devices. Si hay datos usables en medical devices, ¿hay algún ejemplo? Y hay una pregunta que tiene que ver con Argentina, no sé si después se van a querer responder vos, si hay datos usables de real world y utilizables en Argentina.
Con respecto a la pregunta sobre Argentina, creo que la vamos a contestar nosotros, el resto sí,
Bueno.
Kenneth o Laurie.
Sobre devices.
I just wanted, because I was going to
Por
speak
favor.
to Kenneth. I was speaking to Kenneth before, so I know he's on the drug side, but my career has been a lot on the device side. So just to say, the United States, I was really using data from the United States that were really leading the way for really expensive devices like mechanical hearts, for example, where you see this idea of stakeholders were brought together, so industry, the FDA and so on, where they created a registry to monitor, very expensive devices to follow what was happening. And that was sort of conditional on having, if you wanted to use the device, you needed to enter data into a registry. Like that was conditional to get reimbursement for the device or to be able to use it. So there are a lot of examples, and I often talk about, like, my career started 20 years ago, and that the Intermax is a great example, I think, of people working together, collecting real world evidence that really supported decision makings. And that was 2008 that we the first report about that. So there is a lot there that people can learn from.
And Laurie makes a great point. I'm no expert on the device side, given that there are different legislations and mandates, but FDA has been pretty robust in terms of medical devices, in terms of setting up registries to be able to detect the efficacy and safety of these medical products that are used clinically. And that even though there are different, that sort of evidence and data can be used to submit for, safety and effectiveness data into the FDA by the device manufacturers. The existence of multitudes of these sort of patient and product registries does have a lot of real world data to be able to be potentially used in the future by the device manufacturers on the device side for the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health at FDA.
Muchas gracias. Vamos a leer las dos siguientes preguntas para que se genere como una charla entre ustedes. Nos preguntan, ¿qué protocolo se realiza para evitar la manipulación de datos durante el proceso de Real World Evidence? Y después, ¿qué pasa cuando la Real World Evidence no coincide con los resultados de un ensayo clínico de una droga ya aprobada?
I would argue, I know again that, the US often leads the way, is there's a lot of initiatives about posting the protocol right before you start collecting data. You have to say in advance what you're going to do, and that's posted publicly so that it's very transparent, and that can, you know, really prevent the manipulation of data. And I would argue again, I don't know if people read French, but I have a number of reports from when I worked at Este, the HTA agency in Quebec, where most of my HTA, this was for devices, but often a trial and the real world are different, right? And that's why real world data is important. So the patients in a trial are often not the patients that are in the real world receiving the same treatment. The care setting may not be the same. And so there's so many reasons why results from the real world would not be the same as an RCT, but identifying what those are is a really good exercise to support decision-making and to, you know, to be able to guide optimal use of a new device or a new therapy.
Adding on to what Laurie mentions, the other thing besides the transparency is that we encourage sponsors to meet with the division and to go over their proposed real-world evidence protocol. We also have a real-world evidence subcommittee composed of senior leadership on the Center for Drug side and Center for Biologics side that have a number of expertise, those in legal, biostatistics, pharmacoepidemiology, real-world evidence, as well as clinical experts weigh in on these RWE protocols that is submitted onto the sponsor. It is, we view sort of real-world evidence protocols that have not been reviewed with FDA with a healthy skepticism, where the results are basically presented to us. We do encourage sponsors to come to talk to the FDA and to the division where they're planning to submit their real-world evidence protocols before executing them to sort of foster that sense of believability when it is eventually submitted.
That's why this idea of trust is so key, right? In this space, we have to find ways to be able to develop trust in each other.
Thanks, Laurie and Kenneth. Bueno, yo creo que podemos pasar a la última pregunta, Vero, bueno, a las dos últimas preguntas. Y a su vez, bueno, quería avisar que Gustavo de ANVISA se tuvo que ir, por lo cual básicamente no llegamos a despedirlo, pero bueno, lo despedimos ahora. Así que bueno, si querés, Vero, pasamos a la última pregunta.
Sí, pasamos a la última pregunta, está bien. ¿Qué complicaciones relacionadas con sesgos puede presentar una evaluación de tecnologías sanitarias usando Real World Evidence?
Bueno, básicamente la contesto yo y después se lo sumo a San Kenneth y Laurie. Básicamente los problemas son los problemas de los estudios observacionales, María José, ¿sí? O sea, en general los estudios de Real World Evidence son estudios observacionales y los sesgos posibles, ¿sí? Son los sesgos de los estudios observacionales. Más que nada, en general no hay aleatorización. Entonces, un sesgo potencial es que los grupos a comparar no sean exactamente comparables, que es lo que te asegura la aleatorización. Voy a una pregunta anterior que había quedado, ¿sí? Que es básicamente para Laurie o para Kenneth. En su opinión, ¿qué es lo que sucede cuando los estudios de Real World Evidence no obtienen los mismos resultados que los ensayos clínicos?
So one of the things that that FDA is always on the lookout for is sort of these unknown, undetectable biases that are within the populations being studied, which is why randomization really helps sort of distributing these unknown, undetectable biases. The FDA, based on its approval and its process of approval, holds randomized control trials as the gold standard. You know, if evident, and usually the evidentiary standard is 2 randomized control trials. You know, if RWE studies do sort of conflict with that, at least in my mind, it's doubtful that the sponsor would submit that study for additional indications not showing that trials. We also have a robust pharmacovigilance program at FDA that involves both the sponsors as well as our colleagues in the surveillance of epidemiology that look for any potential safety issues that might not have been caught during the phase 4 randomized controlled trials. So, you know, FDA is always being conscientious about things that are potentially missed safety-wise due to the size or the limits of the size of the phase 4 trials when going for the safety and efficacy approval process.
Thanks, Kenneth. Laurie, I don't know if you want to add anything.
I think that was pretty well said.
Perfect, Laurie. Había quedado una pregunta anterior con respecto al uso de Real World Evidence en Argentina, que más allá de Argentina, yo creo que la situación en Argentina no es diferente a la de otros países de América Central o América del Sur, digamos, no tanto Estados Unidos o Canadá, ¿sí? Que tiene que ver más que nada con la disponibilidad de datos, ¿no? O sea, no existe Real World Evidence sin Real World Data, ¿sí? Y el tema es que a veces no es tan fácil, ¿sí?, la disponibilidad de datos en forma ordenada que después permitan realizar estudios. Por lo cual yo creo que la situación en Argentina no difiere a la de otros países de la región, y es que creo que todavía hay que dar varios pasos en relación a la información disponible para después realizar estudios de Real World Evidence. Siento que vamos a avanzar, pero bueno, es necesario todavía tener algunas consideraciones con respecto a los datos. Yes, Laurie, I saw that you raise your hand.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about, especially for rare disease, for example, even Canada, we probably won't have enough people to have, you know, a good number of patients or data. And that again comes down to this trust and collaboration. We need to work together. And we're also considering, and that might be a consideration for you, when would you accept data from the US, for example, or from Canada? So what do you need to think about? You know, we don't know, do we have to collect our own data, or can we use data that is collected from elsewhere? And again, in, you know, my work in the past, I would take this registry data from the US and I would compare it to our data where we'd have much smaller numbers, but just to try and understand. But how, you know, if the care's the same and the patients are the same, then could you argue, well, then you would believe your results if they were the same, right? So it's just that whole exercise. But I think we need to think about, you know, because the resources to collect data. So when can we use data from other sources in other countries? And when do we have to collect our own? And maybe you just need to collect a little bit of data from your own country, if you see what I mean, to confirm or make sure or fill a gap. So I think we need to think in those terms.
Sí, estoy totalmente de acuerdo, Laurie. Yo creo que si dividimos como una parte de datos y una parte de análisis, mi sensación es que en la parte de análisis es relativamente más veloz generar nuevas herramientas o nuevos conceptos de análisis. Pero el componente de datos requiere una estructura que tarda incluso años en ser lo suficientemente sólida para poder obtener datos adecuados. Por lo tanto, yo creo que como la experiencia que mencionó Kenneth del replicate, es como que alguien puede tener una excelente idea y en 6 meses generar un estudio y una estrategia de análisis maravillosa. Y sin embargo, con respecto a datos, aunque alguien tenga una excelente idea, pueden pasar años hasta que los datos están disponibles. Bueno, yo creo que vamos a ir cerrando, ¿sí? Agradezco nuevamente Laurie y Kenneth y Gustavo, que se tuvo que ir. Muchísimas gracias por las presentaciones y por estar en el webinar. Agradezco también de que el IEX en conjunto con el Fondo Nacional de Recursos de Uruguay, que es la agencia uruguaya, y el IETS, que es el Instituto de Evaluación de Tecnologías Sanitarias en Colombia. Ellos son nuestros partners también en esta iniciativa. Bueno, vuelvo a agradecer a todos realmente el interés. Yo creo que el año pasado y este año están siendo como los años de la Real World Evidence. De golpe hubo como una explosión de Real World Evidence. Así que espero que continuemos en la región haciendo avances para una correcta utilización. Y bueno, muchísimas gracias Kenneth, muchísimas gracias Laurie, y bueno, estaremos en contacto. No sé si alguno quiere decir alguna otra cosa.
Just thank you for the opportunity. It's nice to meet new people and who are interested in this space.
Yes,
Thanks, Laurie.
thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I really enjoy being able to connect with our people outside the normal regulatory landscape in the US. So thank you to all.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. Y bueno, muchísimas gracias a todos. Bueno, para los que la semana que viene comienzan el curso avanzado, nos estaremos viendo y a fin de año realizaremos un nuevo webinar. Así que bueno, nuevamente muchas gracias. Un placer compartir tanto estas actividades como la pasión por Real World Evidence.